So, I realize it's been a while since I've done a James randomly reviews something. Um, Had kind of a busy summer. Got to go to Washington, D.C. thanks to my sister. That was fun. Um, then I had to start getting ready for the semester, which started this week. That so far so good on that, though I still have a lot of nervous students. Um, but I finally have something that I can review. No, I'm not going to review last night's WKU football game because, well, that was pretty terrible, and the less said about that, the better. But what I do want to talk about today is a book that my sister was able to get for me. She actually got me two of these. I think it's Volume 1 and Volume 10. My sister is now a librarian, and I would say she's a librarian. She doesn't quite have the degree yet, but frankly, she's always been a librarian. Always took after our grandmother, who was a librarian, and even when we were kids, we would actually take our own books and we would actually put those checkout cards in them, so we kind of kept track of who read what. So, it was always in her blood, and it's really awesome that she's getting a chance to do that now. Anyway, the book that she got for me was a collection of comic books, Uncle Scrooge and Donald Duck. This one is Volume 1 from the Dan Rosa library. It's called The Son of the Sun. I was a little bit surprised by this book. I kind of assumed that it was the older comics, the ones actually my father grew up on. Scrooge McDuck was his favorite comic book when he was growing up. And I kind of assumed that that is what these would be. However, these date back to 1986, and apparently Dan Rosa actually did these comic books from 1986 to 2006, working for a company that was actually named Gladstone Publishing. Gladstone Comics, named actually after Donald Duck's really, really lucky cousin, Gladstone Gander. What's kind of interesting about these particular stories is they're not set in modern times. He didn't really want to tell contemporary tales because the original author, a man named Carl Banks, had basically set out the lifespan of Scrooge McDuck, being born in the 1800s and dying at the age of 100, and he didn't want to discount anything that had happened, and he didn't want to say that it was a fairy tale story where these ducks were basically immortal. So he kind of had a major issue with doing that. Personally, I like what the new DuckTales has done. Is McDuck is quite the adventurer, and he's come across a lot of magic in his life, so he's been able to basically extend his own lifetime. In fact, even his parents are still alive thanks to some sort of curse that he put on them. So I'm perfectly okay with that, and that way you get to tell stories in the modern times. I will say, and this is a collection of both Uncle Scrooge stories and Donald Duck stories, I'm not too crazy, at least in this first volume, at his take on Donald Duck. Donald Duck seems a little too petty. Then again, I'm very protective of Donald Duck, as some of you probably know. It's like my all-time favorite character. So I didn't quite like the take there. The three nephews are fine, Huey, Dewey, and Louie, though they are essentially the same person. But then again, that was kind of the problem with the original DuckTales too. You actually see what Donald Duck and Scrooge McDuck look like in here is fairly close to kind of what you see in cartoons today. Like here's, here is Scrooge McDuck right there. Not really a whole lot different. Here's some old comics from that guy, Carl Banks. The as you can see, the nephews look relatively the same as they do now, though they don't have the distinct personalities that the new one does. Here's actually the cover for the first story. In case you're wondering, that other duck in the picture, that's actually Glomgold. Flintheart Glomgold, you know, Scrooge's main enemy in the old DuckTales and the new DuckTales. Turns out, you know, Glomgold apparently was not one of the favorites of the original author, and really only appeared a few times in the United States until Dan Rosa took over. But one thing that Rosa did is he basically would take things from the Carl Banks stories. Sorry, it's really hard to do this one-handed. And basically continued in that particular world. So all of his stories, basically if his modern day, it took place in the 1950s. Again, wasn't particularly crazy about that, but it is what it is. One thing that you do see in here is while Glomgold looks very different than he does in either of the two DuckTales cartoon series, you do see in these stories that he is a master of disguise, and the new DuckTales has actually explored that a little bit. First story is actually about Scrooge McDuck trying to find a lost Aztec treasure in the Andes. This will shock you. He sort of succeeds, and then Flintheart Glomgold does something stupid, and so they actually both kind of lose out on it. But still, Scrooge, as he always does, wins the bet. In the first Donald Duck story, it's about actually it's an Uncle Scrooge story about Donald Duck and his cousin Gladstone. Uncle Scrooge decides that, you know, both of his nephews, Donald and Gladstone, are fairly worthless, so he says he's leaving all his money to his grandnephews, Huey, Dewey, and Louie, but he feels like he should probably try to set them both up in some sort of work. Gladstone lucks into a lot of things and actually ends up being the publisher of Gladstone Comics, while Donald struggles and ends up basically taking his $1,000, selling an invention he got from Gyro Gearloose, who appears in this comic, so that's where that character came from, and basically got his $1,000 back and a case of soda. The soda was actually kind of a gag because in the 1950s there was a Donald Duck soda. Now, we know you probably have seen Donald Duck orange juice, which I think is pretty bitter, and you probably have seen maybe Donald Duck grape juice, but yeah, there was actually a soda in the 50s, and now I'm just I actually want to collect the bottles now, because, you know, I have a very kind of eclectic taste. Let me see here. There's actually a picture of these bottles. Wouldn't be my favorite, but here are some Donald Duck lime colas. I really should ask my dad if he ever had those. But, you know, that was kind of a fun gag. You get some Donald Duck stories, one where he's being basically a jerk to his nephews, which, like I said, felt kind of out of character. One where he fights with his neighbor, which isn't necessarily out of character because, you know, Donald Duck has a temper. One of the stories is about he takes apart his car so often, he leaves the parts on his yard, and his neighbor sells off every part of his car, so he has to go around and get them back because, you know, Donald Duck is extremely unlucky. And then, you know, in one of the Uncle Scrooge stories, he has to stop the Beagle Boys from stealing his money, you know, because that's what Beagle Boys do. Beagle Boys are going to Beagle Boys. And, he kind of actually brings back a one-time character from the old days, a professor who made cabbages or something. It's kind of interesting. Then there's some holiday stories. All in all, it's a fairly interesting book. I'm very happy that my sister had gotten it for me, and I look forward to reading Volume 10. If I can get my hands on the other ones, I definitely will. It was actually kind of interesting to learn that the author, Dan Rosa, or Kino Dan Rosa as his actual name is, has a Kentucky connection. He was born and raised in Louisville, Kentucky. He went to the University of Kentucky, got an engineering degree, but he absolutely, because of kind of a bad home life, spent a lot of time reading his sister's comic books, and he became a huge fan over the years. And but it didn't look like he would really do much with it. He did some stuff in college for the newspaper, I assume the Kentucky Colonel. Did some political cartoons in high school. Did a series in college. Actually did a weekly series for the Courier Journal at one point. And then kind of lucked into the job doing the Uncle Scrooge comics because frankly, and Donald Duck comics, because frankly, Disney had kind of given up on it, and they had sold the rights to this new Gladstone Publishing. And so, him being a big fan and an amateur artist, he was able to kind of jump on that, and he was able to make himself a 20-year career, which is kind of amazing, from 86 to 2006. Because if you know anything about comic books, that's kind of the period where the bottom fell out, thanks mostly to speculators. Really did a number and almost killed, frankly, the whole comic book industry. In fact, it honestly has never recovered. So, again, while this wasn't what I expected, I'm very happy that my sister was able to pick these books up for me. If you're a fan of DuckTales or Uncle Scrooge or Donald Duck, if you get a chance to read some of these old comics, I definitely recommend it. They were kind of fun. I think we kind of need more comics like this. Sometimes they get too serious these days. So anyway, I guess I've rambled on probably too long. And I'm sure if anyone is watching this, you've given up way before this point. If not, give me a shout out. Let me know. I appreciate the 2 or 3 people who might actually watch this. And I'll be back at some time. I don't know what I'll be reviewing next. If there's anything you'd like me to look at, let me know. I'd be happy to try to do that. Especially Star Trek related. I'm pretty good at that, I'm told. Historical, maybe. Anyway, I guess that's it for now. Everybody enjoy your Labor Day weekend. Don't get too crazy. And see you next time.